two exams work. Okay, suppose I believe, like who is it, Kevin Kline's character in A Fish Called Wanda, that Aristotle was a Belgian. Okay, let's think about how I fare on the two kinds of questions, the two kinds of examinations. First case, the case of exam as testimony. Okay, so I come into the examination room. It's an exam as testimony. The first question says, was Aristotle a Belgian? Well, I know what I believe about that, so I write down yes. And because I've written down what I actually believe, I've got that question right. Okay. That's not at all mysterious when you realize that this is an exam as testimony. The point is just to write down what you actually believe. Okay, but now it's an exam as test of knowledge. Same question, was Aristotle a Belgian? I write down yes, and of course that's the wrong answer. Okay. And the crucial difference is that the second kind of exam presupposes an objective way of being right and wrong. In the first kind of exam, the only way you can be wrong is by writing down something you don't believe, by being insincere. In the second kind of exam, the way you're wrong is if you write down an answer which isn't right in this objective sense. Okay, well now forget about exams and think instead about conversation. What I want to give you is an analogous distinction between two ways in which conversation might work. And I want you to think about the question as to which way it actually works for us most of the time. Okay, so the first one we might call conversation as testimony. And the aim of conversation as testimony is just to say what you believe. Okay, so as long as you're sincere all the time, you say what you believe, then you're doing everything right by the standards of conversation as testimony. The second, by analogy with the case of the second kind of exam, I'll call conversation as test of knowledge. And here the idea is that, well, you don't say that Aristotle was a Belgian unless Aristotle actually was a Belgian. Okay. So which kind do we actually have? Well, obviously, the second kind. After all, think how it would go if we had the first kind. So this is an example of what conversation as testimony would be like in a practical case. Okay, so imagine me, again, believing that Aristotle is a Belgian. I think that's an interesting fact, so I tell you about it. I say, Aristotle was a Belgian. Now, you've got no reason to think I'm being insincere. We're playing conversation as testimony. So what I've said is right by the only standards applicable in the game. You think it's an interesting move, so you say, oh, that's interesting. And then you go on and express your own belief. You say, Aristotle wasn't a Belgian, and neither was Plato. Okay, so you've made your move in this conversational game. Now, clearly, we want to say that the two people here disagree with one another. They disagree with one another about whether Aristotle was a Belgian. But in this game, there's no room for disagreements of that kind. So it's as if our disagreements are just sliding past one another. They're not engaging. And they're not engaging because we don't have a kind of normative standard which makes them engage. Because by the rules of the conversation, neither of us is doing anything wrong here. We're both being sincere, and that's the only rule, to be sincere. So if we both think that the other is sincere in this little conversation, then we both think that the other is right by the standards of the conversation. So we both go home saying, oh, I had an interesting conversation this afternoon. And without any sense that there's, as it were, a disagreement here which might need to be resolved. So the question is, what does it take to stop conversation from being like that all the time, to make conversation stick, or as it were? What I mean by saying to make conversation tacky. What do we need to make our disagreements grip, so they're not sliding past one another in this way? Well, basically what we need is another kind of conversational standard or norm, as well as that of sincerity. We still expect people to be sincere most of the time, to say what they actually think. But we need something more than that. We've seen that we need something more than that. Roughly speaking, what we need is the assumption that our claims have to meet an objective standard of being right and wrong. And that enables us to carry on like this. And I say Aristotle was a Belgian. You say, that's not right. He was a Greek, like Plato. So that's the normal kind of move. And that's the kind of move which we saw wasn't available to us if conversation is just conversation as testimony. But this kind of rightness here is really just truth. See, we can sort of substitute right for true. Doesn't make any difference. But it's not Blackburn's thin, minimal, transparent kind of truth, because we could put that into the conversation as testimony game and it wouldn't make any difference. And that's the whole point about transparent truth. It doesn't make any difference. So what we found here is something that truth, some sort of job that truth seems to be doing in conversation, which the simple kind of transparent truth which people like Blackburn were talking about can't explain, because as I said, that's compatible with either kind of conversation. Well, some people might say, well, does that mean we have to go back to asking Pilate's question? To thinking about the question, what is truth, and try to compare the old choices, correspondence or coherence or pragmatism or whatever. Unfortunately, the answer is no, I think. There's another alternative. Let's go on thinking of conversation as a game invented or evolved by our distant ancestors. And think of this game as having a crucial rule. When you disagree with someone, when you're playing the conversational game, you challenge them by saying, that's wrong, even if you think they're being sincere. So it's a sort of rule of the game that it allows these kinds of challenges. And in effect, the sort of scoring rule in the game is that you score points when someone changes their mind and agrees with you. In effect, when they say, that's right. And this scoring points in this way gives you an incentive to offer reasons for your beliefs, to defend them when these disagreements come up. Now, this is very crude, of course, but I think it's easy to see why playing a game like this might be useful. Because among communal creatures like us, sorting out disagreements can have all sorts of immediate benefits. I mean, in effect, it sort of facilitates a process whereby the kind of combined resources of the combined intelligence of the community can be brought to bear on common problems. And I think that we can explain the most puzzling things about truth, and in particular the things which are kind of at the core of the truth wars, as Blackburn calls them. We can explain those things by seeing that the crucial thing about truth is that it's playing this kind of role in the conversational game. And this offers a different kind of ceasefire from the one that Blackburn was offering us. And in particular, it's a ceasefire which has the striking advantage, or maybe disadvantage, it depends on where you're looking at it from, but it has the striking characteristic, at any rate, that it offers something to both sides. First of all, as we saw, the game requires that we treat truth as objective, in the sense that no one can guarantee that they win just by believing that they've won. Okay, so in order to score points, you have to convince the other side. So it doesn't matter how coherent your own beliefs are. That doesn't win you any points. You've got to convince the other person. So in that sense, truth has to be something more than simply coherent. So in that sense, the absolutists are right. But the game doesn't depend on us occupying any godlike stance outside the ordinary human stance. So whenever we go in for this game, whenever we make challenges, we're always relying on our own beliefs. We're looking for looking, as it were, within our own